The doorbell rings at 8:17 p.m., and for a second I think it's maybe the neighbor with a package or a late pizza I didn't order. The sound is a small, ordinary thing against the downpour, a staccato percussion that cuts through the hum of my exhausted brain. When I open the door, Alexandra Monroe is standing on my doorstep, rain plastering her hair to her skull, a manila envelope clutched in one gloved hand, and that cool, unreadable expression on her face that I've spent 4 years trying to decode. She looks too much like work standing there in my hallway, heels still muddy, coat buttoned tight, the city reflecting off her shoulders. For a moment, I can't tell if she's more terrified or furious. Then she tries to smile, and the smile collapses into something raw. "I couldn't wait," she says. Her voice is the voice that gave order in executive rooms, the voice that made numbers move, but tonight it trembles. "I can't lose you, James." If you like true story workplace dramas, hit subscribe. There's more like this. Her presence on my doormat feels like the narrative of my life snapping into a different tense. Up until that night, my resigning felt like a quiet, private thing, a line I decided to draw for myself after months of being eroded by late nights and a relationship that dissolved into someone else's name on my phone. Now it has a pulse, and it's loud. The manila envelope bulges with a letterhead I no longer want to look at. It is my resignation letter, but that's not what she's carrying. She's carrying a problem she believes I solved by staying. I should say what this looked like before the rain. Rebecca with her suitcase on the stairwell of our apartment, a polite apology that landed like an accusation. Then days of empty space that I filled with spreadsheets and logistics and a brand of productivity that let me feel competent even when everything else inside felt unstitched. I told myself the work was neutral ground, numbers, timelines, process maps. I told myself I could be replaced by hours of effort and a few late nights. But work fed something dangerous, identity. At Apex, they called me dependable. At 3 in the morning, I could tell you which regional manager would cave if you reminded him of his kids' recitals, which vendor would blink first if you shifted the deadline. I knew how to move a company through friction without leaving scars. I knew how to keep the cogs in that immense machine turning. Alexandra noticed me for that. She noticed the way I held the chaos together, not as a glorification, but as a currency. The more I gave, the more necessary I felt. That necessity is a slow tax. You stop remembering who you were before the work. I stopped remembering why I liked the smell of oil and metal when I wasn't thinking about supply chains. That was my dad's thing. I kept a busted old motorcycle in the garage, and when the office let me go, I had a ritual. I'd sink greasy hands into the engine, feel the stubborn parts clack into place under my fingers, and something unaccountably human would return. Fixing that bike didn't make me a different person than the one who could reroute production lines in a crisis, but it reminded me that not all problems could be solved with pivot tables. Rebecca leaving was the kind of rupture you can measure in small, ordinary things. She didn't yell. She folded the silence into a suitcase like it was already trimmed to size. After that, the office became the place I could go where someone else measured my worth. I gave notice because one quiet evening, I realized I couldn't keep living for the approval of the glowing rectangle on my desk. I handwrote my resignation on a Thursday because my hands needed to feel something physical, the paper thick and the pen dragging. I walked into Alexandra's office at noon because that felt right. She took the letter, read it, and for maybe the first time in my life, I saw her not as a CEO, but as a human trying to fit a confession into a calendar. She folded her hands on the desk like an apology. "You shouldn't have to decide this alone," she said. I thought she meant, don't leave the company without talking it through. She meant more than that. The vulnerability in her voice then was a crack in a mirror I had never expected to see. After work, we started calling each other. It was careful at first. Logistics, calendars, a small shared appreciation for stupid podcasts. Then the calls got longer. We found ourselves tracing the same lines of conversation late into the night. Not a romance in full, but a slow burn. A memory of a childhood bike, an offhand comment about the city's best coffee, the way she remembered my mother's name. Those late-night calls were the first place my defenses lowered, because there was no audience and fewer expectations. She kept a level head during the day, but when she laughed on the phone at midnight, it sounded like someone else. We never crossed physical lines at work. There were rumors at the edges,
colleagues who stitched stories together out of shared lunches and private jokes. Rumors are animals that breed in the dark, and rumor was efficient at Apex. HR warned us about optics more than once. We answered every question with practiced candor. We were colleagues, friends even, and nothing more. We kept things compartmentalized. The wall between professional and personal was high, but the storm of my life had begun to wear it down. So when I placed the resignation letter on her desk, part of me expected grief, for the company, for the late-night camaraderie. I did not expect panic. "You're making a mistake," she told me, not in a rebuke, but like someone offering a diagnosis. She said it with the sort of certainty that usually repaired half the things prone to fall apart of Apex. "I need you."
The company needs you. Then came the board rumors. This is the part that anyone in corporate will understand. The fragile piece of an organization depends on confidence. Investors' confidence, clients' confidence, people who sign contracts before breakfast. A week after I handed her the letter, a whisper hit the trading floor. Rumors of a key manager leaving amid speculation about his relationship with the CEO. The rumor wasn't about performance. It was about impropriety, favoritism, a narrative people like to sell when they want to simplify complexity. In the space of a few hours, op-eds and market analysts burrowed in and started to quantify the risk of instability. Alexandra's solution was a late-night drive to my apartment in the rain with the manila envelope. She told me, as if she'd been rehearsing and now had decided the time was right, that she had a plan. She wanted to propose something that would protect us both from the kind of whispers that could become headlines. "A marriage of convenience," she said. The words landed like a small stone dropped into still water. I felt the shock ripple through me in 100 tiny directions. Anger, the sense of being valued as an asset, the embarrassment of standing in my hallway in socks while her shoes shed water on my floor. Before I could say anything, she put the envelope on my kitchen counter. Inside were annotated notes, memos she drafted in the sterile corporate language she always used, but beneath it the language had a different tone. It was urgent and personal. She explained, plainly, "The board is fractious about the impending merger. There are rumors about nepotism that could sink confidence. If an official legal arrangement clarified our relationship and allowed James to move into a public-facing but structurally independent role within an external wellness foundation tied to the company, it could change the optics. It would, she believed, give the board a narrative that is cleaner than whispering rumors. More importantly, she said, it would protect me from being painted as a stooge, someone who is at apex because of favoritism rather than competence." When she spoke, she was careful, methodical. Alexandra is a strategist. Even right then, murmurs of a crisis were parsed in her head like problems with solutions. But there was a different tone under the strategy, fear. Not for the company alone, but for me. "I can't stand the thought of you being pushed out because of this," she said. That sentence, the part where she put my existence on a balance sheet, as if my being there was a risk to be managed, felt like a violation and a compliment at the same time. "You're not asking me to stay because of work," I said. "You're asking me to stay because of you." "I know," she said, "and I'm asking you as someone who'd rather lose everything than lose you." There are many ways to coerce people. Overt threats, quiet manipulations, the quiet arithmetic of someone you respect telling you their life will be worse without you. She didn't threaten me in words. She offered me a life plan like a spreadsheet, but the offer carried weight because of who she was and because of what would happen if the rumor mill continued to churn. An exit that didn't involve my agency, a forced separation, reputational damage that could shadow my career. It felt like choosing between a bad option and fewer bad options. I had read about marriages of convenience before, odd detours people take to protect assets, to avoid scandal in tabloids. In novels, it smells like romance. In reality, it smelled of legal documents and the slow, hard calculus of risk. I told her I needed to know she wasn't asking because it was the only way to keep me employed. She looked at me like someone who had spent the last 4 years hiding a small, tender thing under a suit, like it was easier to hide passions behind board reports. "It's not a condition for your employment," she said. "I promise. I would never—" And then she stopped.
The sentence choked on the practicalities of what it would mean if such a promise were broken. She took a breath. But the board needs a move that stops the gossip and allows you to step into a role where you are publicly positioned as independent of direct influence, a role with oversight designed to remove any suggestion of favoritism. The marriage isn't about ownership. It's about optics and legal clarity. And it's temporary. I propose a sunset clause. 2 years. Clear financial separations. An external trustee for the wellness initiative. HR oversight. Independent legal counsel for you. Public statements explaining the transition. If at any point either of us decides it's not working, the arrangement dissolves. She set the terms down the way she used to set budgets. Precise, defensible, future-oriented. She was not naive to the fact that marriage would complicate things. She told me outright that the board would likely still be uncomfortable, but it would create a narrative they could manage, rather than a rumor they couldn't. It felt like trying to fight fire with more fire. "You're asking me to trade trust for protection," I said. "You're asking me to make the thing that should be private into something you can put on a press release." "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I also know the alternatives. Public disclosure of a relationship without a plan would be worse. You could be forced out to save the company. You could be in a position where your professional achievements are questioned and your future narrowed. I can't promise what the board will do, but I can offer you a measured way forward, with structures that protect you and give you independence." It would be easy to paint her as villainous in a moment like that, a CEO who uses her rank to shape a private life. That wasn't her.
Alex has always been measured. She was the kind of leader people followed because she could make a difficult truth bearable. But the fact that she was offering this to me, and the fact that I was standing there trying to decide whether being offered safety was also an offer of ownership, made me angry in ways that weren't logical. I felt both seen and commodified. No one had ever been so blunt with me about what I meant to them and to the company. "Give me time," I said. "Don't make me decide this on your doorstep in the rain." "I don't expect you to," she said, "but I also can't stall the board. I have a presentation Monday, and they already have questions lined up." She reached into her pocket and handed me a card with names on it. A lawyer she trusted, a mediator, an HR partner with neutrality. "Talk to them. Ask for the written terms. Take it to your brother. Sleep on it. If you don't want to, if this is unbearable, there are alternatives. A public disclosure and an independent search for someone to lead the Wellness Foundation, a sabbatical for you with options to return, a formal separation of your role. But each alternative has risks. I wanted you to know mine." There was a firmness to her apology that I couldn't ignore. She was showing me the worst-case scenario, but also every legal lever she could think to pull. She made it clear I could walk away and take the consequences. That clarity was almost worse than an outright demand. If she had said, "Do this or you're fired," that would have been coercion. Instead, she had given me a map and the key to the safe. I could either lock the door or walk out. I slept poorly. My dreams were of engines and boardrooms fused into one long, looping circuit. In the morning rain, I called my brother. He listened silently as I told him about the offer, about the manila envelope, about Alexandra standing on my doorstep like a thunderstorm personified. "You could be part of a grotesque reality show," he said at last, blunt and protective. "Or you could be part of something that genuinely lets you build your own thing without being tethered. Both options are messy. Does she believe you belong here on merit?" "She insists she does," I said. "She keeps saying she'd rather lose it all than lose me, which is maddening and flattering. I don't know why I'm even considering it." "Because it's also an offer," he said. "Or because you feel like you owe it to yourself after Rebecca walked out. You need to separate the loneliness from the calculus." We talked through the practicalities, forensics of the job market, the razor edge of being labeled the manager who was cozy with the CEO, the probability that with a merger in the air, a scandal could be used as a pretext to cut costs and jobs. My brother, who is a teacher and not used to corporate lexicon, made a point I hadn't considered. Whatever I decide will write the narrative people tell about me for the next 5 years.
Walk away and the story might be he couldn't withstand pressure. Stay and it's he took a marriage for convenience. Neither description thrilled me. I also called a lawyer that afternoon, a woman named Mara, whose number Alexandra had given me. Mara listened and asked questions that felt like combing a wound. Precise, not cruel. "We can draft terms that protect you," she said. We can put in explicit financial separations, a sunset clause, clear definitions of what constitutes public-facing roles and what doesn't, and oversight mechanisms. We can also demand an independent trustee for any entity tied to your role. This has to be a legal arrangement as much as a personal one, if it's ever going to be anything but leverage for someone to use. When I told Alexandra about talking to Mara, she exhaled like someone who had been holding their breath for a long time. "Good," she said. "If we do this, it has to be done properly. HR will be involved. You will have independent counsel. It will be transparent." Transparent, I repeated. The word stuck in my mouth like an accusation. I thought for a long time about transparency and how it is never as simple as it sounds. Transparency can be performative. It can be a spotlight that reveals only certain angles and keeps others in shadow. But it was a start, and I needed something more than motives. We negotiated in the days that followed, slow, bureaucratic, emotional. Alexandra insisted that I keep my agency. There were terms she wouldn't accept and terms I wouldn't either. She agreed that my compensation couldn't be altered by the marriage. She wrote that into a draft. She agreed that any role I would assume in the Wellness Initiative would be subject to an independent hiring process with a board of trustees that included people unaffiliated with Apex. She agreed to a 2-year sunset clause, after which we could either formalize our personal relationship in whatever way we chose or legally separate, with a mediation clause if disputes arose. She suggested we both sign a joint statement clarifying our personal relationship and the professional steps being taken to separate decision-making authority. She also agreed I could take a sabbatical in lieu of immediate movement. This kept options open. 2 years, she said once, looking small in a conference room that usually made her look larger. "Do you realize how strange that sounds?" I asked. "To make love into a product roadmap?" "I realize," she said, wry, "but this is the world we live in. We can make it as humane as possible." I insisted on an independent escrow account for any shared financial matters, on the separation of our assets in writing, on a clause that prevented either of us from making unilateral career decisions affecting the other without third-party arbitration.
We agreed on public statements that would be worded to make the arrangement and the steps taken to defend my professional independence plain to anyone asking. On paper, it looked like a contract. It read like a merger document in miniature. It had the kind of legalese that either made me feel safe or made me feel like the life I had would be defined by clauses and signatures. The more we wrote, the more we tried to anesthetize the moral hazard with words. Even as we drafted, the rumor mill didn't wait. A freelance blogger with a vendetta started asking pointed questions, and within 48 hours, the board called an emergency meeting. Alexandra told me about it over coffee that tasted of nothing because we were both hollowed out by adrenaline. "They want options," she said. "They want choices. There are members who would rather you be gone to protect the brand." "I can't be made into a sacrifice," I said. "Even if I accept the marriage, that's not what this should be." "You won't be," she insisted. "I'll defend you, publicly. I'll put my credibility on the line." Her hand found mine across the table, surprising us both. It was a small human thing in a room full of contingency plans. There is an ethical gravity to a choice like that. If I agreed to the marriage of convenience, I would be entering an arrangement that carried the risk of commodifying private life into corporate strategy. If I declined, I might be cut loose in a way that made future employers ask questions about loyalty and unsaid scandals. Either path would shape the rest of my career, and perhaps my life. Yet there were things the legal pages couldn't account for. What I might feel when the camera stopped for the day, what the nights would do to two people waking up next to each other with shared histories written in clauses, not in honest mornings. The first draft of the agreement included a clause that felt almost sentimental in its bluntness, a mediation clause stating that if either party felt the arrangement was being used as leverage, either could request an immediate independent review. Alex insisted. "This can't be used as a lever against you," she said. "If the board or anyone else ever tries to say, 'Sign this or lose your career,' we call the mediator. We put the pressure back where it belongs." I read that paragraph 3 times. The words were meant to protect me from the very thing that made me queasy, the power imbalance. It was a child's bandage over a fracture, but better than nothing. In meetings with HR, they sketched contingency plans, who would manage direct reporting lines, how to document decision-making to show that my career trajectory was merit-based, how to formalize the Wellness Initiative as an independent charity with its own trustees. HR's neutral language felt like a haven. They were bureaucrats who relied on policy to make things feel manageable. Their presence reassured me and made me nervous in equal measure. The more we tried to institutionalize the arrangement, the more it felt like crafting a legal narrative that could survive bad faith. Still, every draft, every clause, every reassurance came wrapped in the fact that Alexandra had shown up on my doorstep in the rain and asked me to consider matrimonial shelter as a form of corporate triage. My anger toward her quieted into a complicated appreciation. She was not the cartoonish CEO from gossip columns. She was someone who believed, perhaps too fiercely, that she could engineer outcomes that preserved both the company and the people she valued. She had always wanted to be in control. Now she was asking me to let her control something for both our sakes. That asked of me a kind of trust that had little precedent in my life. The night before the board's emergency session, I paged through the draft agreement again with Mara on the line, Alex in the next room. Mara went through every clause, annotating risk like a surgeon mapping an incision. "If you sign, insist on the sunset clause," she said. "Insist on the trustee oversight. Insist on mediation as your right, not your privilege. Do not sign anything that waives your right to future employment independent of the marriage." It felt like bargaining for the smallest pieces of dignity. When I finally called Alexandra to tell her aloud what I needed, she listened and then said, softly, "If this helps you keep your career, take it. If it makes you feel like you've traded something essential, don't. I won't guilt you." "That sounds like a threat framed as mercy," I said, and we both laughed because we were both too tired to be sure whether we were crying. She put her hand to the window of the conference room and wrote something on the fogged glass, a ridiculous small thing, and then pulled her sleeve over the wetness of her wrist. "Whatever you decide," she said, "we'll make the process fair. The board can call for whatever they want in the morning, but they can't pretend I didn't try to do the ethical thing." The morning of the board meeting, the city looked bruised under low clouds. My phone vibrated with messages from colleagues, some supportive, some curious, some almost accusatory. Alexandra texted me the agenda and told me she'd be presenting a plan that involved me stepping into the wellness initiative under independent trusteeship with public disclosure of our relationship and the legal safeguards we had discussed. "Transparency," she typed, "and your counsel will be present." I looked at the manila envelope on my kitchen counter. It had migrated from my hallway to my kitchen like a patient on a gurney. The drafts were inside, the legalese that could either be lifeboat or chain. The smell of coffee did not reach me. I imagined the press leak I couldn't predict, the anonymous op-ed that would insinuate things about loyalty, and the possibility that my name would become shorthand for something ugly.
If I agreed, I told myself, I would enter an arrangement that was prescribed and watched. If I disagreed, I might be pushed onto a different path. Either way, there was no clean path back to the person who screwed greasy bolts on an old motorcycle for the joy of it. There was, I realized, no returning to anonymity. The board meeting began with a hum of procedural talk. Alexandra's presentation unfolded like a strategy to move a mountain. She spoke about stabilizing the narrative ahead of the merger, of safeguarding employees from baseless accusations, of building a wellness program that had its own governance so that the optics of my involvement would be unassailable. She was clinical, persuasive, and then when she needed to humanize, she became a kind of witness to her own failure to be perfect. "I asked James not to make a decision tonight," she said, "but he deserves to know what the alternatives are. We can make the transition without a marriage. We can issue a full disclosure and launch an external search for director candidates. We can offer James a sabbatical with the option to return. But these steps have risks. I propose a temporary, transparent arrangement with independent oversight. It is a stopgap designed to protect the company and James's future." The board's faces were a lesson in corporate anthropology, some tight with fear, some with folded confidence, others already composing their questions in the way vultures maintain patience. We argued through hypothetical outcomes with the kind of specificity that meant nothing if reputational damage had already seeped into headlines. The debate felt less about our lives and more about market caps and shareholder letters. After the meeting, the board deferred. They wanted more detail. They wanted letters from trustees. They wanted contingencies. They also wanted me to agree to something. Alexandra came out of the meeting with her hair more damp than usual at the temples, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She found me in the foyer and took my hand without asking. "You'll have the counsel in the room Monday," she said. "Whatever you decide, it'll be done with eyes open. Do you understand what it feels like to be asked to turn a private relationship into a legal instrument?" I asked her. "I do," she said, "and I know it's not ideal, but I also know what rumors do. I know what they do to people's careers and people's lives. I'm giving you options, not an ultimatum. Use them." That night, I sat in the dark and read the draft again. I circled the words that mattered: sunset, trustee, mediation, independent counsel.
I thought about my father's hands on the motorcycle and Rebecca folding silence into a suitcase. I thought about the phone calls at midnight and Alexandra's laugh. I thought about the board and what it would do to someone else whose career had been built on trust.
In the morning, a new rumor flared. An anonymous tip to an outlet questioning whether the wellness initiative was already a de facto onboarding mechanism for inside hires. The board wanted me to decide before the rumor metastasized. My phone showed a call from Alexandra. When I picked up, she said very simply, "They want to know tonight." I have never felt more like an object and more like a person at the same time. The offer on the table was wild and complicated, and perhaps in its only clumsy way, protective. It was also a negotiation over the language of my life. I put the call on hold for a minute and texted Mara. They want an answer tonight. What do I absolutely need to protect? Her reply came fast. Sunset clause, trustee, mediation rights, no performance-based clauses tied to marriage, written confirmation that your employment decisions will be independent and documented. Get it in writing. Don't sign anything that waives these. I called Alexandra back and told her what Mara said. She listened, and then she bowed her head in a way that suggested exhaustion and relief. "We can lock those in," she said. "If you sign, you get those terms in black and white. We won't move forward without them." "And if I say no?" "Then we do the disclosure and the independent search," she said. "It will be ugly, there will be cost, but I will not, I promise, protect the company at the expense of your dignity. If you say no, I'll fight to make the alternatives viable." Her promise was not a guarantee. It was the voice of someone who could wield influence, sweetened by the vulnerability of someone confessing fear. I had to decide not only what I wanted, but how much I trusted a person who was both my employer and, increasingly, something complicated to me. I looked at the manila envelope, at the drafts inside, and the clauses that felt like both armor and shackle. I thought of Tuesdays in the shop, of Rebecca's quiet departure, of my brother's blunt sentences. The city outside my window had the smell of rain, of asphalt, and all the decisions that come after a storm. My phone buzzed again, another anonymous tip, another tweet. The rumor mill had started chewing. I took a breath, and I wrote an email to Alexandra. I need written terms that include the sunset clause, trustee oversight, mediation rights, proof of independent hiring for any role linked to me, and explicit protection of my compensation and future job prospects. I need HR and my counsel in the room. If you can get me that by tonight, I'll consider it. It was not an answer. It was a demand for dignity wrapped in legalese. It was a refusal to be made into a pawn without a say. Her reply was immediate. "I'll get you everything. I promise you will have counsel and HR. If you still say no, I will respect it." That sentence settled on me like a heavy raincoat, oddly comforting and oddly suffocating. The board wanted options by midnight. The rumor was starting to chart into the mainstream. Decisions were imminent. I sat there with the envelope, the drafts, my father's old torque wrench on the table beside me. The scent of machine oil like a tether to a life where value wasn't always measured by headlines. The choice in front of me was not only about career survival. It was about whether you can manufacture consent when the stakes are so high that refusing feels like losing everything you built. I thought about consent as layered, not a single moment, but a series of choices you make again and again. If I were to accept, I wanted each of those choices documented and honored. If I refused, I wanted a plan that protected my career anyway. Then my phone lit up with a notification, an article I hadn't read yet, with a headline that flattened me. A leak. The rumor had become a story. The next words came in from my brother, from Mara, from colleagues. The city outside blurred into the smear of rain on glass. Alexandra called. She said, "They are asking me to do something now. We need a yes to move fast, or we go public with everything as a controlled disclosure. Or I can say no," I answered, and for the first time in days I felt a tiny, trembling line of clarity. But if I say no, I need a plan that isn't just "we'll try to fix it." I need more than promises. She inhaled. "You'll have it," she said, "tonight. I will not do this without protecting your agency." I put the phone down and looked at the manila envelope as if it were a puzzle piece that could be rotated to fit. The clauses were there, the options were on paper. The heart of the decision was not legalese. It was whether I could trust a plan and a person to respect my autonomy when the world outside wanted a simpler story. I walked to the garage, picked up the old torque wrench, and ran my fingers across the knurled handle. The metal was warm under my palm. In the quiet of the shop, I turned a bolt and felt the resistance shift under my hand.
It was a small, physical reminder that not all problems demanded a choice between bad and worse. Some problems could be worked on, part by part. When I came back inside, Alexandra was still waiting on the couch. Her phone dimmed, papers spread like a map. She looked like someone who had been stripped down by the weather and the day, but the steadiness in her eyes had not left. "Tell me what you need to know to say yes," she said. I thought about bargaining chips and dignity and legalese and my father's oil-smelling hands. I thought about Rebecca and my brother and midnight calls and the way a rumor can calcify into a verdict. I thought about what keeping someone means when the person being capped is asked to trade their private life for a legal document. "I'm not saying yes tonight," I said, "but I'm not saying no either. I'm saying I need all the terms on paper. I need outside counsel in the room. I need a sunset clause. I need trustee oversight and mediation.
I need a commitment that this will not replace my right to independent employment. Give me that, and I'll consider it." She nodded. The rain had slowed to a whisper. For a moment, everything felt like it could be negotiated into decency. "Okay," she said. "I'll get it to you. I'll get the counsel. We'll do it by tonight. I don't want to push you, James. I want to protect you." "Then prove it," I said. She smiled. Not the composed smile of a CEO, but a human smile that wanted to be believed. "I'll prove it." Outside, the rumor churned. The city held its breath. Inside, two people sat with a manila envelope like a shared problem that might or might not be soluble. The legal drafts were a hedge against something nameless that could either undo us or save us. I left my signature off the draft that night. I left a line open for negotiation and another for mediation. I left the torque wrench on the table, like a reminder that sometimes fixing things required deliberate, patient work, not dramatic moves born of panic. And then the phone buzzed again with an alert. A new story, a new angle, and a headline I didn't want to read. The board wanted a decision that would go into public minutes. The next steps would be planned in rooms where reputations are worth billions, and people are only sometimes remembered as people. I picked up the manila. I picked up the manila envelope again, thumb tracing the fold where the drafts had been clipped together so many times it looked softened, like a worn coin. The words on the pages had begun to mean different things to different people. To some, a career-saving maneuver. To others, a headline to chew on. To me, they were the map of an uncomfortable new country I might have to move into. By midnight, the final drafts were in my inbox. Mara had tightened language until it felt watertight. Trustee oversight, explicit recusal of Alexandra from any decisions affecting my role, a 2-year sunset clause on the mediation trigger, escrowed funds for any joint financial matters that might be necessary to administer the public optics, and a statement that my hiring to any public-facing role would proceed through an independent search committee. The document also included a paragraph that felt almost pleading in its simplicity, a mutual promise that neither of us would leverage the arrangement against the other. Lawyers never write pleadings like that unless two people have asked them to. When I read it, my hand shook, not from fear only, but from the weight of choosing between legal safety and the dignity of refusing to be packaged as the answer to a PR question. I imagined a future where my name would be tethered to a footnote in an investor report, the kind of thing that removes the edges from a life and leaves a headline. "Can I ask you something stupid?" Alexandra said from the couch, where she had been keeping watch like a sentinel. She looked smaller than she did in a glass-walled strategy room. The city lights turned the hollows under her eyes into gentle shadows. "Is this what you want? For us to read our lives in clauses?" "No," I said. "But I want to be sure that if I do it, it's because it's a choice I made while I still recognized myself." She nodded. "Then we will write more words. We'll make them ironclad. If you're uncomfortable at any point, we stop. If you ever feel used, Mara calls the mediator. HR will monitor. We'll make this public and clean, so there's nothing left to whisper about." The words felt like armor, and like an explanation at once. I wasn't sure which I wanted more. The following week was a study in formalities. Alexandra presented the plan again, this time with Mara and the HR representative in the boardroom. The trustees we proposed were professionals from outside Apex, leaders in nonprofit governance, law, and employee wellness. I sat in the far corner, feeling the fabric of my suit like paper against the swell of attention in the room. Reporters were already circling. Anonymous op-eds had started. The board wanted assurances that the move would stabilize the merger talks, rather than destabilize them. Alexandra gave the presentation as she always did. Crisp, complicated problems turned into steps. Then she did something that surprised almost everyone. She stepped out from behind the slides and addressed the room without the safety net of charts.
She told them she was asking for trust, and she told them, plainly, that she would make herself accountable. She said my name in full, not as a risk item on a spreadsheet, but as a person whose work mattered. "This isn't a stunt," she said. "It's a structure, and it has checks. James's career will not be a footnote in a rumor. We owe him better than that. We also owe our clients and shareholders clarity during this transition. There are people who greet speeches with thin applause, and others who greet them with checks in their pockets." The board asked the hard questions. Some members were openly skeptical, others quietly practical. By the time the discussion closed, the board deferred on a formal vote until they had legal confirmation on the trustee agreements and evidence the wellness initiative could operate independently of Apex's executive structure. Outside the meeting, one board member pulled me aside. He did not mince his words. "If you do this, swear to me you'll be more than a symbol," he said. "If they think you're a figurehead, they'll eat you alive. Use the chance to make something real." That, more than anything, felt like a challenge. It altered the terms of my decision. If I was going to be part of this, I would insist that the wellness program be substantive and that my role have real deliverables, a budget, and metrics. I would have to show, not just claim, that my work stood apart from the personal narrative being spun around me. So I negotiated as hard as I could.
The agreement we signed that week was not pretty, but it was explicit. Independent trustees, a binding recusal clause for Alexandra in all decisions directly affecting the wellness initiative, a salaried position for me established through an external review with a published job description, and the sunset clause with mediation built in. There was also a public statement drafted in clear language designed to cut rumors off at the pass, a disclosure of our relationship and the governance steps taken to protect the integrity of hiring and operations. The agreement included guarantees for my compensation and the right to pursue other employment in the future without penalty attached to the end of the 2-year clause. Signing felt like stepping into a crowd with both hands up. It felt legal and cold and, simultaneously, somehow humane. I signed because I wanted to keep working, and because in the long dinner conversations Mara and my brother and I had had, the possibility of building something that mattered, not only to me but to other people who were exhausted and worn, seemed worth the complexity. The press release was immediate. Apex announces Strategic Wellness Initiative, Transparency Measures Implemented, the headline read on the company site. The statement included the words we'd hammered out. The company affirms its commitment to independent governance for the wellness initiative and to ensuring fair and transparent employment practices. The rest of the world, as ever, consumed it as it wanted, but the mechanics were in place. The first months were not dramatic in the way that novels make them out to be. They were instead a slog of establishing governance, trustee meetings, procurement processes, hiring panels, memorandums of understanding. I met with therapists, organizational designers, and community partners. I wrote a curriculum for a manager resilience program. I hired 2 people who had never worked at Apex precisely to avoid impressions of an inside hire. The trustees scrutinized every line item I proposed, sometimes with a skepticism that felt personal, but it was necessary. Their scrutiny hardened the initiative into something robust rather than purely symbolic. The rumor mill quieted as transparency grew. Headlines shifted from "What does his name mean?" to "New Wellness Initiative aims to reduce burnout at major firm." The market didn't crash. The merger talks inched forward. The board seemed oddly relieved that the issue had a legal architecture they could inspect. A strange byproduct of the formal structure was that it forced boundaries at home. We developed public rituals, joint statements issued by counsel, separate calendars for professional meetings, rules about who sat where in which rooms. Those rituals allowed us to keep a private life private and a public life accountable.
On the weekends, we tried to make room for things that were not clauses, late breakfasts, the sort of quiet that might reset someone's nervous system. There were awkward moments. I once caught a rumor monger from a trade paper at a small industry event staring at me like I was a specimen under a microscope. I felt the old shame flare up, the same small ember that had glowed when Rebecca left. But then someone approached our booth at that event and told me, unprompted, that the manager resiliency workshop I'd led last month had helped her team reduce sick days by 18%. She talked about having a manager finally listen and reconfigure workloads without ridicule. That kind of feedback was oddly antidotal to the gossip. It reminded me why I had chosen to stay. It wasn't only about security. It was about creating a program that could actually keep people whole. Our private life crept forward in minor, stubborn ways. We learned each other's small rituals. Alexandra liked her coffee too hot and drank it slowly, like she was burning away a worry. I preferred mine bitter and loud.
She kept a postcard on her desk of a small chapel she once saw in Tuscany. I kept an old photograph of my father getting his motorcycle back together, hands crossed in grease. We mixed these artifacts into our home like a patchwork quilt. When things were bad at work, we argued like anyone would, through email threads and late-night check-ins where tempers and exhaustion made grayer shadows. When things were good, we traded small mercies, the only cup of coffee not finished at a meeting, a sentence said at midnight. 2 months in, I took a day off and drove my motorcycle upstate. Alexandra insisted on coming along, which was the most normal and weird thing I'd ever experienced. The CEO who chaired emergency board meetings and the man who kept a torque wrench in his living room, both on a rusted bike built more for the feel of the road than for prestige. We rode for hours. There were silences that did not demand explanation and short bursts of conversation that didn't require strategy. We stopped at a diner and ordered pancakes like two people who'd been told to breathe. That trip was a hinge. It didn't pivot the entire relationship into romance overnight. It simply allowed us to be two people without an audience. She told me stories about her childhood that didn't involve quarterly targets. I showed her a dent in the gas tank from when my father and I had misjudged a turn. Small human things. The way she tucked the hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The way I remembered all the wrong lyrics to songs and she would correct me gently. Those small exchanges began to create a history that wasn't underwritten by the legal status of our lives. Back in the office, the wellness initiative started to show measurable impact. Reduced turnover in a pilot cohort, a measurable decrease in reported overtime among certain teams.
Better engagement scores in groups that had historically been near burnout. Critics remained. One columnist called our arrangement curious and made a point of alluding to the romance in a way that felt sleazy. But the trustees published hard numbers and process reports. The program had, even in its infancy, made things better for some people. That reality was a salve. It made the arrangement feel less like a stunt and more like a bridge. Still, the moral friction never vanished. There were days when I felt like a contract. There were moments I doubted whether I would someday wake up and find that the person beside me had been prescribed as wardrobe for a company narrative. We had clear mechanisms for addressing those moments. The mediation clause was more than a signature. It became a conversation starter for the hard things. Once, when a miscommunication about a public interview rattled both of us, we called the mediator and let a neutral party separate the personal emotion from the public tactic. That process felt almost revolutionary. To insist that our personal boundaries had legal weight was to refuse the dissolution of our personhood into rumor. The trustees and HR insisted on documentation of any conversation that could even slightly be construed as a conflict of interest. Alexandra recused himself from certain meetings, and often we ate dinners apart when there were late presentations and M&A strategizing. Those adaptations didn't make us less intimate. They made intimacy deliberate. We had to choose the small, ordinary acts of care instead of assuming them. That work was educational, and it was not always graceful. The 2-year mark approached with a strange compound of anticipation and quiet dread. The sunset clause had been written not as an expiration of feeling, but as an invitation to decide. We had both been careful not to let the convenience calcify into a permanent structure that would prevent honest decisions. The clause required that at the end of the 2 years we would either choose to end the arrangement cleanly or enter into whatever future we wanted. Marriage, stable partnership, separation, with mediation to assist negotiations about shared property, if any existed by then. In the 18th month, something shifted. The program had scaled. Turnover fell in target departments. Managers reported better engagement. My name was no longer an entry point for rumor as often. People knew me for the workshops I led and the initiatives I had launched. The trustees praised the progress in public letters. The board had fewer angry questions and more interest in the metrics our initiative produced. The optics that once threatened to topple the company had, to a degree, been managed. But what the numbers couldn't measure was the slow accretion of small, personal commitments. There was a Wednesday night when I came home exhausted and found the kitchen table cleared and 2 cups of tea cooling.
Alex had taken the day off to organize her father's papers, a private thing she had to do, and had left the tea because she knew I'd be home late. I sat down, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a life more complicated than legal clauses and corporate risk. "Do you remember when you told me you'd always wanted to learn to paint?" she asked, stirring her tea. "I do," I said. "I thought you meant landscapes." "I meant that I always wanted to learn something that wasn't about improving something else," she said. We enrolled in a weekend watercolor class the following month. If anyone had tracked our life in headlines, they'd have written it up as a quaint anecdote. For us, it was an exercise in softness. 2 people used to controlling outcomes, putting down their pens and smudging color onto paper that refused to be blamed for anything.
When the sunset clause came up for its final negotiation, we were ready with a dossier of what had and hadn't worked. We sat with lawyers and trustees and put our cards on the table. The question was not only legal, it was ethical and personal. Did we want to continue an arrangement whose original impetus had been to shield us from gossip, or had our lives shifted enough that we could choose freely without the scaffolding that had once felt necessary? There were nights I imagined a dramatic choice, slamming down the papers and walking away from everything. There were other nights when I imagined staying, but on terms that felt naked and honest. We talked, honestly and often. We invoked the mediator whenever the personal got too thick for two tired minds to manage. There were arguments, ferocious, honest, occasionally petty, about how to split holidays, how much we allowed each other to be visible in the press, and whether a ring could or should be more than a legal symbol. By then, I knew how to say what I meant. I wanted to be with someone whose affection was elective and resented no clause. I wanted a partner who could be my person independent of the company. But I also knew that there were parts of my identity that fed me in work that had nothing to do with romance. I didn't want to lose either, the capacity to do work that mattered and the capacity to love someone without contracts as scaffolding. We decided finally in a small mediation office overlooking the river. The trustees listened, a neutral face among them. Mara sat across from me and held the packet of documents like a talisman. We read and rewrote the final clause together. The agreement would not simply sunset into non-existence. Instead, it would be replaced by a living agreement, an exit plan that involved a public statement acknowledging that the government structure had been successful and an explicit endorsement from the trustees that the wellness initiative could stand on its own. The trustees would continue oversight for 6 months after the legal conclusion to ensure continuity, then step back.
We agreed that any decision to formalize our relationship beyond that would be wholly personal, and that any legal entanglements would be resolved through the mediator by mutual consent. "It feels like an ending," Alexandra said quietly when we signed the final line, "and also like the start of something messy and real." We chose, in the end, to convert the contract into a promise we made without lawyers present. We did not do it in a press event. We did it in a friend's backyard with a few close people. My brother, Mara, who insisted on coming to celebrate one honest end of business, and a couple of our friends from the wellness initiative who had become like family. We did not sign anything to make our cups of coffee valid. We only promised aloud to keep choosing one another without clauses as the only scaffolding. I remember standing under string lights, the air warm in late summer, and feeling a music in my chest I hadn't been able to feel for a long time. It wasn't certainty, which I had never been afforded. It was the gentleness of shared choice. We'd started something as a legal device, because sometimes the world throws you into a corner and you have to draft a way out. But over time, in the slow and patient maintenance of boundaries, trust had been built. We had learned to negotiate not just with contracts, but with tenderness. The wellness initiative continued to grow. The trustees published a final report that noted measurable improvements in retention, a drop in long-term sick leave, and more equitable workloads across departments. The board used our work as an example of how to invest in people as strategic culture, rather than mere optics. That felt like a small, vindicating victory. The company installed policies on manager burnout, instituted mandatory unpaid leave for certain roles, and created an anonymous reporting form where employees could flag perceived conflicts of interest without fear. Seeing those changes put into policy made me feel less like the subject of rumor and more like an architect of something that mattered. As for us, the private life kept its quiet education. There were mornings when Alexandra would slip into the garage and help me tinker. She learned to hand me the spanner without comment, a gesture as intimate as any kiss. There were times I sat in her office while she worked through a complicated decision and offered my perspective, not as a subordinate, but as someone who knew the contours of her life. We argued, of course. Sometimes petty things, whose turn it was to take out the trash, became sessions where we learned to be clearer about expectations. We made mistakes, and we asked for forgiveness. 2.5 years after I left my formal role at Apex, I stood in a small registry office and watched Alexandra and I exchange names in a language stripped of legal scaffolding. Our vows were not theatrical. They were simple promises to continue choosing one another without clauses.
No clause, no sunset, no trustees. Just the awkward certainty that lasts when two people decide they'd rather risk the mess of honesty than live under the security of an agreement drafted to preserve a company's image. We tell people different versions of the story. To some, it's a romance that began in corporate crisis. To others, it's a case study in governance and the law. To me, it's both and neither. It is the memory of a rainy doorstep and an envelope that asked me to weigh dignity against security. It is the memory of a bike whose stubborn parts reminded me of a man I used to be. It is also the memory of sitting in a boardroom and watching a woman stand up and fight in a way that did not always feel comfortable, but was sometimes necessary. Looking back, the most important lesson is that nobody should ever be told their private life is the cost of their career. The world will try to measure you in easy narratives. If you can, insist on complexity. Make sure promises live in documents and hearts both. Demand counsel, insist on mediation, and refuse deals where your consent is only assumed. A marriage of convenience can be a legal tool. It is not a moral eraser. If it is to happen, it must be fair, transparent, and reversible. Above all, it must allow the person on the other end to choose again and again. I didn't stay because the CEO begged for my life. I stayed because, after a long negotiation, legal, emotional, moral, a path opened that allowed me to keep the work I loved while also not losing myself to it. We built structures to prevent the worst of power dynamics, and then, collectively, we did the messy work of learning to be human with each other. The arrangement that began as a legal strategy became in time a real partnership, not because of the contract, but because we chose it, without coercion, with oversight, and with the willingness to walk away if that choice ever became a trap. If you found this story compelling, leave a comment and tell us what you'd do in my place. Would you accept a marriage of convenience to protect your career? And if you want more true-life workplace romances with complicated, real consequences, check the playlist for similar stories, the ones where romance meets reality, and people try to rebuild their lives in public and private. Thanks for staying with me through the rain and the paperwork.